At 6:48 a.m. on June 19th, 1944, over the Philippine Sea. The morning light cut through a thin haze, turning the ocean below into a sheet of silver glass. Inside a P-38 Lightning cockpit, Lieutenant Roy Haskins tightened his grip on the control stick. Oil fumes mixed with the salt air. The temperature inside the canopy was already climbing past 90 degrees. 30 miles ahead, black dots shimmered on the horizon. Japanese fighters, hundreds of them, closing fast. His oxygen mask pressed against his cheek as he checked the gauges. Fuel, 60, 2%. Ammo, 270 rounds per gun. He was alone. The rest of his squadron had scattered minutes ago when radar screamed, "Multiple inbound." Haskins breathed once, slow and deliberate. Then he saw it, the faint reflection of the rising sun on his gun sight. It danced across the glass like a ghost line. And in that flicker, he remembered the one thing no instructor at flight school ever mentioned. You could shoot by reflection, not by sight. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. 2 years earlier, he'd been fixing tractors on his father's farm in Iowa. He learned to judge distance by glare on metal, by how sunlight bounced off the curve of a plow. Now that same instinct was all he had. The manual said never fire inverted. But the manual didn't care if you were outnumbered 30-1. The first enemy formation broke left. 20 Zeros dove out of the Sunday. Haskins rolled his P-38 upside down, the world flipping into chaos, sky below, ocean above. His finger hovered on the trigger. The gun sight disappeared from view, yet the reflection on the canopy glass stayed aligned with the lead fighter. He squeezed once. Tracer lines cut through the air. The first Zero burst into flame, then another, and another. Radio chatter exploded across the channel. "Who's firing inverted? Who the hell is that?" Haskins didn't answer. He was too busy lining up the next reflection. For the next 4 minutes, his insane trick would rewrite every rule of air combat. The battle that morning was part of what history would later call the Great Marianas Turkey. Shoot a name that sounded like a joke until you saw it from inside the cockpit. The Japanese had launched more than 400 aircraft from 3 carriers. A massive counterstrike meant to push the U.S. Navy out of the Philippine Sea, once and for all. The sky was so crowded with contrails and black bursts of anti-aircraft fire that it looked like a thunderstorm made of metal. Haskins's unit, the 431st Fighter Squadron, had scrambled 12 P-38 seconds at dawn to escort bombers heading towards Saipan. By 6:40 a.m., half of them were already gone, either shot down or forced to return to base with fuel leaks and shredded wings. The remaining aircraft were spread thin, each pilot fighting alone against swarms of Zeros that moved like a school of sharks through sunlight and cloud. Command channels were jammed with overlapping calls, fragments of coordinates, and desperate shouts that dissolved into static. Haskins had never flown a real mission before that week. He was 22 years old, fresh from a training field in Arizona, where the air was dry and the sky empty of enemy aircraft. Now he was 200 miles from the nearest friendly base, strapped into a machine vibrating at the edge of mechanical tolerance, trying to remember every word of a manual that no longer made sense. The book said altitude was life, speed was safety, discipline was survival. But discipline didn't help when a Zero could roll inside your turn before you even saw it coming. The P-38 was a masterpiece of engineering on paper: twin engines, twin booms, long range, heavy guns, but its very design made it clumsy in tight combat. At low speeds, the torque from the counter-rotating propellers pulled unevenly, forcing pilots to fight their own aircraft as much as the enemy. Haskins had felt it in every training loop: the sluggish roll, the delay between his hand and the aileron's reply. The mechanics called it within spec. Pilots called it death lag. Below him, the Pacific shimmered like polished steel, reflecting the silhouettes of burning planes tumbling toward the waves. Each explosion sent a pulse of orange light that flickered through his canopy, momentarily turning the cockpit into a furnace. He could smell the hydraulic fluid overheating, could feel the vibration through his boots as the engine strained at full throttle. The radio was silent now. The squadron frequency had gone dead. He was alone. A single P-38 cutting through smoke trails that arched like scythes across the sky. In that moment, the old rhythm of the farm returned to him, the steady hand on the tractor wheel, the instinct to correct before the drift grew too wide, the way sunlight could reveal a straight line better than any instrument. War, he realized, was no different. It punished hesitation and rewarded precision. And somewhere between the roar of engines and the shimmer of light on his gun sight, he understood that the only way to survive was to ignore every rule ever written for pilots who weren't supposed to make it home. The problem with the P-38 wasn't courage or training, it was geometry, mechanics, and the cruel arithmetic of time. At high speed, the twin-boom design that made the aircraft beautiful also made it slow to roll. The long aileron cables stretched across 30 feet of fuselage, and every inch of flex added milliseconds between input and response. In a turning fight, those milliseconds meant the difference between a firing solution and a funeral. Japanese Zero pilots had learned to exploit that flaw within weeks of first contact. They would lure the heavier American fighters into tight horizontal turns, then slip inside the radius like a knife sliding through fabric. Once a Zero got on your tail, the fight was over. Its 20mm cannons could tear through aluminum and armor in less than a heartbeat. The manual told P-38 pilots never to dogfight, to climb and dive instead, to use altitude and speed as shields. But in real combat, altitude was a currency that vanished fast, and speed evaporated every time you pulled the trigger. Haskins had read the manual cover to cover. He respected the engineers who wrote it, but he also knew that blueprints didn't bleed. The men who built the airplane had never faced tracer fire cutting across their windscreen, never felt the lag of a control cable as a Zero curved beneath them. He'd felt that lag dozens of times already, an invisible delay, small but lethal, like hesitation turned mechanical. When he moved the stick, the plane hesitated, just long enough for his sights to drift off target. By the time the guns fired, the enemy had already rolled clear. The Mark II reflector sight was supposed to fix that, projecting a glowing dot that stayed centered no matter how the plane moved. In practice, it lagged too, especially during negative G dives when the gyro inside struggled to stabilize. Haskins noticed the drift one afternoon during a gunnery exercise over Tinian. He'd fired a 3-second burst and watched every round pass high by the same margin. The instructor called it pilot error. Haskins called it proof. Something about the light path, the angle of reflection through the canopy glass, was off by fractions, but in combat, fractions killed. Back on the carrier, he spent nights tracing lines across maintenance charts, comparing trajectories and sight alignment data, searching for the invisible fault. He found it not in the gun mounts or the wiring, but in how the sun struck the sight glass at certain roll angles. The reflection shifted the perceived aim point by just a few inches, yet at 300 yards, that meant missing by yards. It wasn't the plane that failed, it was the physics of light itself. The regulations forbade tampering with the sighting system. Every component was calibrated at the factory, sealed, and stamped with inspection wax. But regulations, he thought, were written by men who fought with pens, not bullets. If he could realign the convergence of his guns to match the reflection he saw on the canopy, he might erase the delay entirely. It was madness, maybe even sabotage by the book. Yet the more he calculated, the more the math insisted he was right. That night, while the deck crew slept, he crouched beside his aircraft with a flashlight wrapped in red cloth, marking new convergence points with a grease pencil. The sea wind carried the smell of fuel and salt, the same mixture that had followed him from the farm to the front. When he finished tightening the last bolt, he stood for a moment, listening to the ocean breathing below the carrier hull. The fix was simple, almost absurd, a few turns of a wrench, and the courage to break the rule that kept everyone else alive just long enough to die by it. 2 days after he adjusted the sight, the squadron flew another interception mission at dawn. The air was heavy with humidity, the horizon still pale gray when they climbed through the first layer of cloud. Haskins could see the reflections of his wingmen glimmering below him, a fragile constellation of silver shapes moving through the mist. They were laughing over the radio, trading jokes about breakfast, pretending the day ahead wasn't another lottery of survival. By noon, 5 of those voices would be gone. The first loss came quick and quiet. Lieutenant Mark Stevens broke formation to chase a Zero diving toward the bombers. He followed too long, too steep, and never came back. The radar plot showed a bright blip vanishing into static. The second loss came minutes later when a shell burst ripped through Harold Dean's engine block, turning the right boom of his P-38 into a torch. Haskins heard him cough through the microphone, a short, wet sound, and then nothing but wind. He tried not to look down, but the ocean made witnesses of everyone. The sea was a mirror filled with falling fire, each reflection a brief life ending in smoke. There was no time to grieve, no room for anger, only the numb rhythm of turning, diving, climbing, and firing again. The sky had rules of its own rules that punished emotion faster than bullets. Still, every time he squeezed the trigger and saw the tracers vanish into empty air, he felt the old rage rise like acid in his throat. That evening, the carrier deck was lined with stretchers covered in olive-drab canvas. Mechanics stood beside them in silence, their faces lit by the dull glow of signal lamps. Someone played a harmonica badly, the notes breaking apart in the wind. Haskins walked the length of the deck, counting boots, flight tags, patches, anything that could prove these men had once existed beyond the smoke. When he reached the end of the line, he realized there were more names than planes left to carry them. He sat alone on the edge of the catwalk, watching the sea roll black beneath the moon. The metal under his hands felt cold, alive, as if the ship itself was breathing with the ghosts it carried. He thought of Stevens's laugh echoing through the headset, of Dean's quiet cough, of the way both sounds now lived only in static. The manuals said every loss was the price of air superiority, but the manuals never mentioned how heavy silence could become when it filled a man's headset instead of a friend's voice. When dawn came again, he was already in his flight gear, helmet unbuckled, gloves half on. The crew chief asked if he wanted to skip the sortie and rest. Haskins only shook his head. There was no rest left in him. The sky would take everyone eventually, but he refused to let it take them without reason. If his adjustment worked, if that ridiculous idea about reflection and geometry actually made a difference, then maybe those deaths would count for something more than another line in a report. He strapped himself into the cockpit as the engines began to whine, the turbines coughing blue smoke into the rising light. The world outside blurred as the carrier turned into the wind. Somewhere below deck, the chaplain was still reading names. Haskins tightened his harness and whispered the last words of a prayer he didn't really believe in anymore. Then he pushed the throttle forward and watched the ocean tilt beneath his wings, carrying the weight of every voice he could no longer hear. 3 nights after the funeral detail, Haskins sat in the maintenance bay surrounded by the smell of solvent and hot metal. The hangar lights flickered with each roll of the carrier, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the line of grounded aircraft. Mechanics were still working in silence, patching bullet holes, replacing panels, pretending not to notice the man who hadn't slept since dawn. He sat beside his P-38 with a clipboard on his knees, drawing invisible triangles in the air, tracing the geometry of a sightline that shouldn't have failed but somehow always did. He had been trained to trust the numbers, to believe that every tolerance and every angle was measured by men smarter than him. Yet the battlefield had a way of exposing what equations refused to admit. When he checked the gun mounts that evening, the markings still matched the specifications in the manual: 300 yards convergence, plus or minus 5. Perfect by the book, lethal by reality. He angled a flashlight along the barrels and saw how the light hit the glass of the reflector sight, bending slightly before reaching the reticle. That tiny distortion was invisible during tests on the ground, but at 15,000 feet, under the glare of the Pacific sun, it shifted the aim by almost a body length. He wrote the numbers on a scrap of paper torn from the back of a logbook, rechecked them, and felt the unease turn to certainty. The delay wasn't in his reflexes or the cable tension. It was in the physics of how the sight perceived the world. The pilot's eye saw one image, the mirror another. Between them was death, measured in inches. The discovery felt too small to matter and too dangerous to ignore. The next morning he brought his theory to Captain Reeves, the squadron engineering officer, a man who measured authority in microns and hours logged. Reeves listened, jaw tight, eyes never leaving the coffee cup in his hand. When Haskins finished, the captain exhaled through his nose and said flatly, "If you're telling me you want to modify an optical gun sight on a combat aircraft, you're out of your damn mind." Haskins tried to explain that it wasn't a modification, just a realignment, a correction to match what the pilot actually saw in combat. Reeves cut him off before the sentence ended. "You want to change factory calibration? That's sabotage, Lieutenant. You'll ground every plane on this ship if you start touching optics." The meeting ended the way every war argument ends. One man clinging to protocol, the other clinging to survival. Reeves filed the report away, promising to review it after the operation. Haskins walked out of the office with the paper still in his hand, folded once, then again, until it was small enough to fit behind his flight badge. Rules had their own gravity, and on ships like this, they pulled harder than conscience. But gravity could be beaten if you understood the angles. That night, long after lights out, he returned to the hangar with a wrench, a grease pencil, and the stubborn belief that math was worth disobedience. The Pacific wind slipped through the open doors, carrying salt mist that settled on the aluminum skin of the plane. He climbed the ladder, ducked into the cockpit, and pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the canopy. The ship groaned under his feet as if warning him that this was madness. Maybe it was. He loosened the gun mounts by a quarter turn, adjusted the convergence down to 150 yards, and etched a single white mark beside the reticle alignment screw. It wasn't factory spec anymore, it was his. When he stepped back onto the deck, the horizon was glowing faint orange, a new day rising over a war that didn't care about rules. Somewhere below, the engines rumbled awake for another sortie. He looked at his hands, black with grease, and wondered if the line between engineer and outlaw was always this thin. Then he smiled, just once, because for the first time in weeks, the geometry finally made sense. The morning patrol launched at first light, the sky clear and merciless above the Pacific. The deck crew moved like clockwork shadows, guiding each fighter into position as propellers screamed and salt spray whipped across the flight line. Haskins climbed into his cockpit with the calm of a man who had already accepted his own obituary. The smell of hydraulic oil and canvas filled his helmet as he locked the harness tight, his fingers tracing the small white mark he had etched beside the gunsight screw the night before. No one else knew it was there. No one would understand it even if they did. At 7:11 a.m., the formation lifted off the deck, 12 silver arcs rising into the dawn. The first 20 minutes were uneventful radio chatter, altitude checks, the distant hum of bombers droning toward Saipan. Then radar crackled with static and fear. Multiple bogies, Angels 15, closing fast from the west. The call repeated twice before the sky erupted. Tracer lines slashed upward, through the clouds like burning ropes. Haskins rolled into a climb, feeling the G-force crush against his ribs, his eyes narrowing behind the goggles as black specks grew into silhouettes. The Japanese had arrived. They came in disciplined pairs, sweeping down in mirrored dives, their engines shrieking through the air. Haskins pulled hard left, rolling the P-38 into an oblique turn that barely kept him inside their line of fire. A burst of cannon shells shredded the air behind him, fragments tapping against the tail like hailstones. The warning light blinked red, but the controls still responded. He leveled out, heart hammering, the world spinning in streaks of blue and silver. The sight dot flickered against the canopy glass, drifting with each movement of his hand. The numbers in his head returned angles, offsets, the way light bent through glass at 45 degrees. When the next zero overshot him, he didn't follow the manual. He cut throttle, rolled inverted, and dove. The horizon flipped, ocean above, sky below, and the weight vanished from his body as negative G pressed against his chest. The gun sight disappeared from view entirely, replaced by a thin reflection dancing on the canopy curve. The zero flashed across that reflection, a dark cross of motion against the brightness of the sea. Haskins didn't think. He trusted the math, the instinct, the absurdity of it all. He fired. 4 streams of 50 caliber tracers tore through the air in a perfect arc. The rounds met the zero mid-turn, ripping the wing clean from the fuselage. The explosion bloomed like a sunrise beneath him. Haskins rolled upright, watching the fireball tumble toward the water, and for a heartbeat, he forgot to breathe. It had worked the insane idea, the reflection shot, the disobedient geometry of survival. He didn't have time to celebrate. Another pair of zeros came from above, crossing paths in a scissors maneuver meant to trap him between their guns. He pulled hard right, then rolled inverted again, aligning their shadows with the reflection on his canopy. 2 short bursts, precise, mathematical. One enemy disintegrated instantly, the other spiraled away, trailing smoke. Radio silence broke with disbelief. "Who's firing upside down?" someone shouted. "Jesus! He's doing it again!" Haskins ignored them. His breathing was steady now. Each pull of the trigger, a confirmation that chaos could be solved with logic. The plane shuddered from recoil, the smell of cordite and engine heat mixing into a scent that would never leave his memory. When the last zero broke formation and fled, he leveled his wings, staring through the smoke-laced air that had once been full of death. The canopy reflection still shimmered faintly, as if the sun itself had decided to aim with him. For the first time in the war, he felt like the machine and the man were thinking together, and that was enough to make the impossible seem almost reasonable. For the first 10 seconds after he fired, the radio stayed silent, as if the entire sky had paused to breathe. Then a voice crackled through the headset, half disbelief, half awe. "Holy hell, did you see that? He flipped it and nailed him." Another pilot laughed, the kind of laugh people make when they can't decide if they've just witnessed brilliance or suicide. Haskins didn't answer. His hands were too busy tracing the next pattern of motion, his eyes following the ghost line of light that danced across the canopy glass. The reflection shifted every time he rolled, a living compass only he could read. A second Zero dove toward him, its guns flashing white arcs through the clouds. He countered not with a climb, but with another inversion, the world turning upside down again. The blood drained from his head as the G-force reversed, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of silver and flame. The reflection slid perfectly across the glass, intersecting the silhouette of the approaching fighter. He squeezed the trigger once, twice, rhythm steady, mathematical. The tracers curved upward like ribbons of light, each burst landing exactly where he had predicted. The Zero disintegrated mid-roll, fragments scattering into the morning haze. The radio came alive with chaotic cheering. "That's two! He got two more! What the hell is he doing up there? He's flying backward!" None of them understood that it wasn't luck or madness. It was geometry, muscle memory, and a farmer's instinct for straight lines. Every movement was a correction, learned from years of driving plows across uneven ground. Every calculation born from watching sunlight bounce off steel. Haskins didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a mechanic inside a machine that had finally agreed to listen. He leveled the P-38, checked his ammo, and saw only 180 rounds remaining. 4 minutes of flight, maybe less. He scanned the horizon and spotted 3 Zeros regrouping for another pass. Instead of retreating, he climbed into the sun, rolling inverted again just before the enemy reached firing range. The reflection on the canopy found them first. 2 short bursts controlled, deliberate, and 2 black plumes erupted below him. The third Zero tried to break away, diving toward the ocean. Haskins stayed inverted, eyes fixed on the reflection instead of the gun sight, and fired a final burst. The tracers intersected the fleeing aircraft at a perfect angle. It vanished in a bloom of orange light. When he rolled upright, the sky around him was empty. Smoke trailed across the sea in jagged streaks that marked where his targets had fallen. He looked down at the glint of sunlight on the water and saw, for the first time, what calm looked like in the middle of war. His breathing slowed. The plane felt lighter, more responsive, almost alive. The reflection trick wasn't a trick anymore. It was a language between man and machine. "Confirm 5 kills," the squadron leader finally said over the radio, voice trembling between excitement and disbelief. "Repeat 5 confirmed. What's your status, Lieutenant?" Haskins looked at the gauges, fuel half, ammo low, engine steady, and keyed the mic. His voice came out calm, almost amused. "Still here, sir. Just testing a theory." The channel erupted with laughter and static. Somewhere, a voice muttered, "That farm kid just rewrote the manual." But Haskins barely heard them. He was already turning back toward the sun, hunting the next reflection, feeling the invisible rhythm that only he could see. For the first time in the entire war, he realized he wasn't surviving by luck, he was surviving by design. By midday, the sky above the Philippine Sea had turned into a furnace of sunlight and smoke, a shifting cathedral of sound and vapor, where logic no longer belonged. The radio crackled with half-words, coordinates, orders dissolving into static as the battle expanded beyond sight. Haskins had stopped counting the number of aircraft overhead. The air itself seemed alive, 1,000 machines tearing through the same narrow space, each trying to write its own survival into the clouds. His flight leader was gone, his wingman too, and somewhere below the horizon, carriers burned like floating cities on fire. He leveled the P-38 for a heartbeat, scanned the chaos, and saw 4 Zeros slicing through a formation of bombers 3 miles ahead. He rolled into a dive, the sunlight flashing against the canopy, his mind tracing invisible lines of angle and distance. The altimeter spun. The G-forces crushed his chest until his vision pulsed white at the edges. At 8,000 feet, he inverted, lined the reflection across the canopy curve, and fired. The first Zero exploded instantly. The second flared into smoke, spiraling downward with its wings sheared away. The remaining 2 tried to break formation, but his next burst cut one in half before the other vanished into a storm of tracer fire from the bombers. That was the moment the rhythm took over, the precise, terrifying cadence of instinct and machine. Each maneuver flowed into the next without conscious thought, as if his body had become an extension of the aircraft's circuitry. Every reflection, every vibration of the trigger, translated into destruction hundreds of yards away. He dove, rolled, climbed, and inverted again, always following the shimmer of light instead of the gun sight, the canopy now his true horizon. Hours blurred into fragments of movement, an engine warning light flickering red, a burst of shrapnel slicing across the nose cone, a brief glimpse of parachutes blooming over the sea. The kill count grew with the smoke trails, 10, then 20, then 30, until numbers stopped meaning anything at all. He no longer remembered the sequence of targets, only the texture of recoil, the smell of cordite, and the way the reflection never lied. Once, during a break in the fighting, he caught his own reflection in the canopy eyes, bloodshot, face streaked with sweat and oil. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. The boy from Iowa was gone, replaced by something colder, mechanical, necessary. He wondered if genius always felt this close to insanity, if survival demanded the surrender of everything that made you human. Then another warning call snapped through the static, and the thought vanished with the next burst of gunfire. When the last enemy fighter fell away, flames trailing across the endless mirror of the Pacific, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. His hands trembled on the control stick, not from fear, but from exhaustion, so complete it bordered on euphoria. 36 confirmed kills, 6 hours in the air, engines overheating, ammunition almost gone. The sun had already begun to sink, painting the smoke a dull copper hue. Haskins exhaled slowly, the sound lost to the roar of the propellers. He looked down at the ocean, glittering beneath him, scattered with black stains where the wreckage still burned. The reflection on the canopy glowed faintly in the fading light, the same ghost line that had guided him since morning. He realized then that he had crossed some invisible line between innovation and madness, between invention and myth. The radio came alive again, someone shouting his call sign, demanding a status report. He pressed the transmit button, voice quiet, almost detached. "Still flying," he said, still reflecting. When Haskins landed on the carrier deck that evening, the world felt slower, heavier, as if time itself was waiting to catch up with him. The deck crews swarmed around the aircraft, shouting over the roar of idling engines, waving signal paddles through the smoke that still hung like fog above the sea. His P-38 touched down hard, tires screaming against the steel runway, leaving thin black streaks that marked the end of an impossible day. He cut the throttle, pulled the canopy release, and let the wind slap against his face. The smell of burnt oil, salt, and gunpowder filled his lungs. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt like a man who had just outrun gravity but wasn't sure if he'd cheated the laws of nature or rewritten them. The first officer on deck didn't speak. He just pointed toward the hangar bay, where a group of engineers were already waiting. Someone had filed a report. Unexplained accuracy, possible modification. Within an hour, Haskins was sitting in a folding chair under the glare of inspection lamps, watching two mechanics crawl over his aircraft like surgeons over a body. They measured everything: control cable tension, gun mount spacing, optical alignment, reading off numbers to a clerk with a clipboard. Every time one of them muttered, "Not per spec," the officer in charge scribbled faster. Finally, Captain Reeves appeared, the same man who had dismissed him days before. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried the weight of bureaucracy sharpening its knife. "Lieutenant, we found tool marks on your sight housing," he said slowly. "Care to explain why a combat pilot is altering government property?" Haskins stayed quiet for a moment, staring at the grease under his fingernails. He could blame the vibration, the recoil, anything, but he was too tired to invent excuses. "Because it didn't work," he said. "Not the way it was built. I just fixed it." Reeves paced, tapping the clipboard against his thigh. "You understand this is a court-martial offense?" he said. "Unauthorized modification of weapon systems in active combat zones. That's sabotage, Lieutenant." Haskins met his eyes, calm, almost serene. "If it's sabotage," he replied, "then why are we still alive?" The room fell silent. Outside, the deck thundered with another wave of takeoffs, the war continuing without pause. Inside, the engineers exchanged glances, each man suddenly aware that the aircraft before them had done what no one thought possible. One of the younger technicians broke the tension. "Sir," he said softly, "look at this." He adjusted the canopy latch, tilted the frame, and watched as a thin beam of light reflected perfectly across the reticle. The alignment was flawless. The sight line that had been a factory defect now produced zero parallax at combat angles. The numbers didn't lie. The modification wasn't reckless. It was elegant. Reeves stared at it for a long time, his anger dissolving into something more complicated: respect, maybe fear. "You're telling me he corrected a design flaw in the middle of a war zone," he muttered. The technician nodded. "Yes, sir. And he did it with a wrench and a pencil mark." Reeves turned back to Haskins, the weight of military order pressing against the undeniable truth of results. "You understand we can't put this in the official report," he said finally. Haskins smiled faintly, exhaustion softening the edge of defiance. "I didn't ask for a report, sir," he said. "I asked for a plane that shoots where I aim." The investigation ended without a verdict. The paperwork vanished into a file labeled Technical Anomaly, and the officers pretended not to see the white mark near the sight adjustment screw. But the mechanics knew. The next morning, every P-38 on the deck had a new pencil line etched in the same place, no orders given, no questions asked. 3 days after the battle, the carrier anchored at Ulithi Atoll for refueling, and the engineers seized their chance to turn Haskins's anomaly into an experiment. The aircraft was rolled onto a temporary test line near the stern, the sea glinting bright blue just beyond the edge of the deck. 2 technicians set up calibration boards at varying ranges, while another rigged a set of mirrors to simulate -G flight angles. The air smelled of salt, hot paint, and bureaucracy. Reeves stood with a clipboard, pretending his curiosity was just procedure. Haskins watched from a few yards away, arms crossed, helmet tucked under one arm, trying not to look like a man waiting for judgment. The first test used the standard gun sight alignment. They mounted a camera inside the cockpit, locked the stick, and fired a controlled burst into the target range. The result was predictable. Impacts scattered 6 feet high at 200 yards, drifting even farther under simulated roll. The second test used Haskins's adjustment. The white marked screw turned a 1/4 inch counterclockwise, gun convergence reduced to 150 yards. The reflection across the canopy now aligned exactly with the reticle. When the gun camera whirred and the barrels thundered, the bullets tore through the bullseye so perfectly that even Reeves took a step back. They repeated the test again and again, each time adjusting the roll, the dive, the pitch angle. The data was impossible to ignore. The modified alignment reduced the average lag time by nearly 4/10 of a second, a lifetime in aerial combat. It also increased hit probability under -G maneuvers by 32%. One of the engineers, a soft-spoken man named Connolly, whispered the words none of them wanted to say aloud. "It works." Reeves frowned, not because he disagreed, but because agreement meant rewriting everything they'd been trained to believe. By afternoon, the test crew had stopped arguing and started measuring. They drafted an internal memo, bland and bloodless, titled Field Correction of Gun Sight Convergence, Observational Data. No mention of names, no mention of a farm kid who broke the rules, but the numbers spoke for themselves, and numbers were louder than medals. Reeves signed the paper without meeting Haskins's eyes, muttering, "Effective immediately. This stays between us." Haskins just nodded. He didn't need credit. He only needed proof that madness could be method. Later that night, the results reached the fleet's ordnance division, then the mainland. By the end of the month, a small revision appeared in the maintenance directive for P-38 squadrons. In field conditions where optical distortion is observed, minor convergence adjustment may be authorized by crew chief discretion. It was bureaucratic camouflage for what everyone already knew, a quiet admission that one man's disobedience had outperformed the manual. Haskins read the update under the dim yellow light of the ready room, his name nowhere on the page. The words felt clinical, empty, but beneath their detachment lay the rarest thing in war, truth verified. He closed the folder, leaned back in the metal chair, and listened to the distant hum of engines echoing through the ship's hull. Outside, the ocean stretched endless and indifferent, carrying both the wreckage of battles and the weight of new ideas. For once, he didn't feel like he'd cheated the system. He'd simply found the line where theory failed and reality demanded correction, and had the nerve to cross it. By the spring of 1945, whispers about the reflection trick had already crossed the Pacific, passed quietly between maintenance crews and young pilots who didn't care where ideas came from as long as they worked. No one mentioned Haskins by name. They just called it the mirror shot, a phrase that sounded half superstition, half miracle. Flight instructors began adding it to informal training, disguised as experimental sighting technique for limited engagement scenarios. Within months, squadrons from Okinawa to Iwo Jima were marking the same faint white line beside their gun sight screws, pretending it had always been there. At first, the command treated it as rumor, a piece of folklore born from too many missions and too little rest. But the reports kept coming, improved accuracy, shorter engagement times, fewer losses in dogfights. Engineers from the Ordnance Department flew out to observe, expecting chaos, and instead finding precision. Pilots inverted, rolled, and fired through reflections exactly as Haskins had done, and the results were undeniable. What began as one man's act of defiance became a pattern in the data, a quiet revolution written in bullet holes that finally lined up where they were supposed to. In late July, an internal memo from the Army Air Forces authorized formal testing at the Wright Field Research Center in Ohio. The document was written in sterile language, full of numbers and clauses, but the last line carried something close to wonder. Observed improvement suggests the method warrants further study. That was how the military admitted it had been wrong politely, indirectly, mathematically. By the end of the year, new manuals for advanced flight training included a footnote in small print. Pilots may utilize canopy reflection for auxiliary targeting during high-angle maneuvers. It was as close to acknowledgement as history ever gave him. After the war, the idea lived on. Jet pilots in Korea rediscovered it when early Sabre fighters faced MiG 15 seconds at extreme roll angles. They called it low-G burst alignment, unaware that the principle was older than their engines. The engineers who updated the manuals never met Haskins, never knew that a farm kid on a sunlit deck had risked court-martial to make their numbers cleaner. But his fingerprints were there, hidden in every adjustment table, every tolerance specification, every clause about pilot field discretion. Haskins himself returned to Iowa in 1946, discharged with no medals beyond the standard campaign ribbons. He bought back the family farm, rebuilt the barn, and worked the soil as if the war had been someone else's dream. Neighbors said he never spoke much about flying. When kids asked if he'd shot down any planes, he'd just smile and say, "I missed less than I should have." On clear mornings, when sunlight glanced off the roof of the tractor, he'd sometimes stop for a second, watching the reflection slide across the metal. It still aligned perfectly, as if the world hadn't forgotten the lesson he'd taught it. By the time new generations of pilots learned the mirror method in simulators, his name had vanished from every record. But in the invisible geometry between light and motion, between fear and calculation, his presence remained a ghost in the canopy, guiding aim through reflection. And somewhere in the quiet fields of Iowa, the man who once outthought gravity still woke before sunrise, just to see how light behaved when it met steel. History never kept the names of the men who thought sideways. It remembered the generals, the medals, the victory parades, but not the moments when survival depended on someone daring to be wrong at the right time. Lieutenant Roy Haskins never called himself a hero. He said once, in a letter that no one published, that heroes were just people who didn't have another option. What he built wasn't glory. It was precision, born from grief, crafted in defiance, proven by necessity. The world moves forward because someone, somewhere, decides that obedience isn't always the same as duty. In the decades that followed, engineers would design smarter targeting systems, digital gyros, and radar-assisted optics, each claiming to remove the human flaw from war. Yet every innovation still began the same way, with a question whispered inside a machine. What if it could work differently? Haskins had asked that question in a storm of smoke and metal, when asking was a death sentence. He didn't have computers or laboratories. He had reflection, instinct, and a willingness to trust the evidence of his own eyes over the printed word. In that act lay the quiet definition of courage, the kind that doesn't roar, doesn't march, doesn't demand applause, but changes everything it touches. Somewhere above the Pacific, pieces of his P-38 still rest on the seafloor, corroded and silent, the white mark on the gun sight long dissolved by salt and time. But in every cockpit that carries a trace of his logic, in every adjustment knob, every calibration curve, every pilot who ever questioned a manual, his work endures. It exists not as a monument, but as a principle. That war, brutal and senseless as it is, still rewards the mind that refuses to stop thinking. The story of Roy Haskins is not about victory counts or confirmed kills. It is about a man who learned that knowledge, in its purest form, is rebellion against chaos. His insane trick was never madness. It was mathematics forced into courage. And maybe that's what every war needs, beneath the noise and fire. Someone who sees order where everyone else sees disaster, who can take a single reflection of light and turn it into survival. If you stand in sunlight on a clear morning and look at your own reflection on glass, you'll notice how it moves slightly when you do always parallel, never perfectly aligned. That tiny misalignment is the space where invention lives, the gap between how things are and how they could be. Haskins lived in that gap, and though the world rarely remembers his name, every bullet that flies straighter, every pilot who trusts instinct over doctrine, still carries a fragment of his defiance. So remember this: the war was won by those who disobeyed wisely. The machines got faster, the weapons more precise, but it was the mind behind the metal that truly evolved. Roy Haskins's reflection burned for only one day in 1944, yet its light still travels through history, through invention, through every engineer who dares to see the impossible, not as madness, but as the first line of a better design,